Well, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Let's start out with the question about the current election. Most elections are about whether or not the incumbent deserves to be reelected. Why, in your opinion, doesn't Congressman Bishop deserve to be reelected by the voters of the 1st District?
Well, you know, obviously I'm running for a reason. I'm not running for my health. I'm running because I feel we ought to have some changes. I looked at this race and I looked at the national scene in general. There's a lot of frustration out there. There's a lot of frustration with incumbents. Congressman Bishop was in when he was with the majority party, with the president's party, and essentially they wrecked this economy. They wrecked the American economy. They drove it down, and in the process of trying to rebuild it, of course, a lot of mistakes have been made and things, but I think at this point we've got to get on track, and I don't see why we should continue sending people back to Congress, to Washington, who have put us in the mess we're in. It's not something that should be done, and we need to get back on track as a nation.
What are some of the issues that the Republicans specifically took on that wrecked the economy, and what kinds of specific votes would Representative Bishop have made that would have made him complicitous in the wrecking of the American economy?
Well, you know, we could put a blame in a lot of directions, and I don't put it all squarely on one side or the other. I mean, historically, we've set ourselves up for what's going on here. By never addressing the deficit and continuing to spend recklessly, we ended up being, you know, obviously in a huge mess, and of course now the deficit's ballooned even more. To me, that's a huge issue. How could they have stopped that or put some brakes on that? Well, you know, just the war in Iraq, for one thing, the amount of spending that goes on, it's something I call crony capitalism. It's basically you get people that are your friends, they government contract, and they make exorbitant amounts of money. Halliburton's an example of this. The embassy in Iraq's an example of this. They spent, you know, $5 billion, $10 billion, $100 billion. Well, now we're talking numbers of over $3 trillion to contract out for this war, and, you know, we don't know where all the money's gone. The Congress is a watchdog over the purse of this country. And so if they don't watch out for our resources, our money, then it just is a blank check to whoever wants it. Bishop could have stood up to that. He could have tried to put some brakes on that, but they just kept rubber stamping everything that was coming down from the president on that, and we ended up now with a huge, huge deficit we have to deal with.
So when you talk about rubber stamping what the president, you rubber stamping what President Bush wanted.
Yeah, well,
back when he was in office.
I think there was some mistakes, big mistakes in priorities.
What then is your plan for deficit reduction? What are the various features and trade-offs between taxes and spending that you would encourage to bring this deficit into line?
Well, a couple of things we've got to do. One, there's just some basic fiscal restraint. You have to start looking at every single department of the government and start going through and systematically cutting waste out of the government, and there's a lot to cut. I have a son that's in the U.S. Air Force. We were talking one day, and he says, you know, we had to spend $600 to buy a little screw. I said, what, some kind of special screw for a special purpose? He goes, oh no, you could have bought it at Lowe's or Home Depot, but it cost us $600. Well, somebody's on the take there. Somebody has lobbied and got a no-bid contract or something, and they're basically walking away with huge profits. That kind of stuff, we can just start to go item by item, hopefully, and start to attack that kind of a waste in government. That's one thing. The other thing, and of course the big debate now is taxes. Do we extend the Bush tax cuts? Do we not? And we can go kind of back and forth. Do we extend them for that multi-millionaire, billionaire group, which is the big discussion right now? It's kind of the hang-up on that. Of course we should, at this point, not have a tax increase on the middle class. You know, people are hurting right now. There's a lot of unemployment. The economy is very, very weak right now, and those sectors need to be encouraged, not discouraged.
So if you're talking about the Bush tax cuts and extending them, you would extend them for those people in the middle class or making $250,000 a year or less.
Yeah, definitely that.
But for those people making $250,000 a year or more, would you favor extension?
Well, here's where my take is, and I've kind of going from a bottom-up approach. I'm looking for some people looking at people that have explained some things to me, and I've wrapped my mind around this a little bit. But if we look at part of the problem was a Congress that was negligent and an administration that was negligent. But part of the problem too was this derivatives market. These traders that are trading on the hedge funds and those kinds of things. these individuals are making billions and billions of dollars, but yet have wrecked the economy in the process. And to me, I think a very simple solution, which is one of the criticisms I have with the Democrats with this financial reform, is they could have put a 1% fee on all speculated derivatives trades. Now, estimates say that that could add up to an amount of maybe $500 billion a year. That means, guess what? No tax increase for anybody. Just put a fee on those speculative trades that have put us in the mess in the first place. The people that are responsible for the economic crisis are now paying for the economic crisis, and the rest of America can get back to work.
But that would essentially be a tax increase on the wealthy, or at least on the business that they conduct, right?
On the transaction especially, yeah, sure, a hedge fund transaction, sure.
But if you were in Congress and had to vote between a middle-class tax cut or increase, or keeping it the same, versus a tax increase for the wealthy, those people who make those families make $250,000 or more, would you vote for that?
I may raise the ceiling a little bit on that, but I think definitely the middle class should not be increased at this point. The velocity of exchange of money right now is slowed way down, and the people that are spending it almost immediately and getting the economy pumped up are those who are in the middle class that would be affected most by a $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000 tax increase in the next year. So you wouldn't want to clamp down on that at all. I think that would be definitely an economy killer.
You mentioned earlier the frustration that people have with Congress. Approval ratings for the job Congress is doing are at historic lows in the high teens, maybe the low 20s, depending on the poll you're looking at. What's the reason for the low approval rating of Congress, and what specifically can be done to improve Congress's approval rating in the eyes of the American public?
Well, I think bottom line, the economy. If people are feeling more comfortable and more confident about the future, more confident about their own personal economies, more confident about the national economy and the future, then obviously that starts to dissipate. I think traditionally Congress has always had a low rating. And I think the reason why people look at Congress with a very jaded eye is because they see individuals go back to Washington and they seem to all prostitute themselves out. They seem to sell out to a lobbyist or to some bank, for instance, the banking lobby. We have this conversation here, you and I, and the banking lobby could have 4 or 5 lobbyists sitting in our congressman's office right now. And then their PAC could be writing out checks for their reelection. And people kind of get a little cynical. And when they get cynical, and with the economy down, the combination of the two puts them in an absolute horrible public opinion zone. And so I think we've really got to start examining, what it is people want. People want accountability. They don't want to feel like they've lost their government to forces that they have no control over. And, we have to get that accountability, that transparency, that level of respect back, but I don't know that we can until we get the economy back on track, because people are, quite frankly, scared and they're mad. When you get scared, you get mad. It comes off as anger, and there's a lot of anger out there.
What specifically might you consider, though, when you're talking about these interest groups and the influence that they have on members of Congress? Does that mean lobbying reform of some sort? Does that mean reducing the amount of money that political action committees can give to, to congressional campaigns?
Yeah, it's a good question. There has to be a complete overhaul of the system. One thing I'm very much in favor of is some sort of publicly funded campaign reform. So the 2 individuals, maybe the 2 that are polling, maybe there's a limited amount that could be raised on a local level from individuals, so it's very close to the ground. You start looking at where funding is coming from most campaigns. It comes from outside the districts. And now, of course, with the new Supreme Court ruling and those kinds of things, it's carte blanche. So somebody, if you've got $1 billion and you want to write out $1 million check to some private organization that promotes your cause.
Yeah, it wouldn't go directly to a candidate.
Yeah,
it could be spent in
but you
the
could start
campaign.
Microsoft, for instance, could come in and elect our Congress here, or Hal Burton could come in and elect our Congress here. They could pump 10 or 20 millions into a campaign of somebody they got behind, and that would be problematic too. I think if we can get to some kind of a publicly funded campaign, then that way you're on an even playing field. That's one issue. And the second issue, and of course this goes into state politics a little bit here too, is on reapportionment. I think we ought to have a reapportionment district commission, not done by the legislature. Don't have the politicians write their own districts. Have a commission write it where you have 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, 5 independents, and maybe a three-judge panel or something to deal with little disputes, and then set the districts up more equitably instead of so lopsided.
So there's more competition.
Yeah, absolutely. More competition would be wonderful. I mean, we keep talking about free market here in a way, but in the political zone, we want to have much more of an exchange of ideas, and I think the more competitive it is, it would keep our political people much more responsive to the people on the ground.
What about bipartisanship? Could you name, if you were elected to Congress, a Republican that you would like to work with while you were in Congress, that would you could work in a kind of friendly bipartisan way across the aisle?
I have a lot of respect for and admiration for Ron Paul. And some people try to classify him as on the fringe or on out there, but what I've noticed about Ron Paul is is very principled. And I like that. I think the man's got some principles, he sticks to them. He's got some good ideas, and some ideas that I really appreciate. I like what he's trying to do to get some reform in how we do our monetary system. I think our monetary system's absolutely out of whack, and he wants to audit the Fed. In fact, he paired up with a socialist, independent, Bernie Sanders on the audit the Fed bill. Bernie got his passed, but Ron Paul did not. But he's one individual I would be interested in just kind of getting to know, because I like the tenacity he has, and he doesn't back down, and he's very principled.
Recently, parts of the health care reform legislation that were passed by Congress and signed into law by President Obama actually went into effect. Would you have favored that piece of legislation, and if so, which parts of it?
You know, what was produced, I'm not a big fan of. I'll tell you the truth right now. I am not a big fan of. I think healthcare reform is something that needed to be done and had to be done. My biggest gripe with what they produced was that they brought in kind of 11th hour, as things were sort of falling apart. They brought in the pharmaceutical companies, they brought in the insurance companies, and the insurance and big pharmaceutical basically drafted that bill to their liking. There was no cost controls, there was no getting to the point of making sure this was going to be economical, and it was kind of pushed through. A bipartisan approach, yeah, but I think the climate in Washington probably would have never allowed it. I think there's better options, and I would have looked for potentially the allowing of regional cooperatives. I think might have been a great idea to push the competition. See, there was nothing in the bill to force or to push the insurance companies to go into a competitive state, and so they can keep the prices high, they can keep kind of doing the things. Some of the reforms I think are probably pretty good in the bill, but for the most part, a lot of what was in there was in my opinion, very much manipulated by pharmaceutical insurance companies, and unless there's some serious reform to it, I think there's going to be some problems with what comes down the line. Now, having said that, they say, and we're not sure where that's going to go. They say that there's going to be access to insurance, and we'll add 30 to 40 million people that didn't have policies. But we don't know. It's such a far out thing now. I think it's 2014 before we see the major portions of it actually even going into effect. So I guess it's yet to be seen.
How about the war in Afghanistan? Would you be would you be a reliable vote for President Obama's foreign policy in Afghanistan? Would you have voted for the troop surge in Afghanistan?
We had issue because what happened, we got sidetracked in Iraq. Iraq was not a very well thought out engagement. Osama bin Laden was in Afghanistan. That's where the terrorist bases were. We should have put our time and effort and energy surgically removing that element. Now what we've got, because of the distractions, we now have been in that country for 10 years. The Taliban has sort of hardened themselves into the mountains, and it's a very difficult task to get them out. My son's in the military, served 2 tours of duty for and in support of the troops there in Afghanistan. And so I very much think we ought to be supporting our military men and women. We need to make sure that they're safe as possible. We need to make sure they have the equipment they need. We need to make sure that they are supported not only there, but when they come home as well. We shouldn't be leaving them without the support that they need. It's a psychological burden on them. It's a long effort. It's the longest war effort we've ever been in. But I am confident in General Petraeus. I think it was a good move to move him in on the ground there. I think he'll make efforts to hopefully see a resolution to this conflict soon, and very soon. I hope that the efforts work.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.